Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. The love that dares not speak its name in this century is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the sonnets of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is the deep spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect. It dictates and pervades great works of art like those of Shakespeare and Michelangelo, and those two letters of mine, such as they are. It is in this century misunderstood, so much understood that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name. And on account of it, I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful, it is fine, it is of the noblest form of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it. It is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an elder and a younger man, when the elder man has intellect and the younger man has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him. But it should be so. The world does not understand. The world mocks at it and sometimes puts one in the pillory for it. Hello, and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster. Welcome to episode 2 of Oscar Wilde. So that speech that I just read was the celebrated speech given by Oscar Wilde at his second trial, completely off the cuff, by the way, where he is defending himself against a charge of gross indecency that has been brought to him in the wake of the collapse of the libel trial that he brought against the Marquess of Queensberry, who is the father of Wilde's lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, or Bosie as he's known. And he, in that speech, he's pretty clearly talking about himself and Bosie and denying that there is anything indecent about it at all. I mean, it's an amazing speech. It was said at the time that it was the finest speech of an accused since that of St. Paul before Herod Agrippa. It's a very, very extraordinarily elegant, articulate, and moving defense. Of course, as Wilde's biographer Matthew Sturgis, who wrote an absolutely wonderful biography called Oscar, points out, the problem is that actually Wilde is not on trial because of his relationship with Bosie. His trial is for the misdemeanors, as they would have been called at the time, with a succession of 17, 18, 19-year-old office boys, clerks, waiters, servants, to whom that description doesn't really apply. That being said, I think Wilde would actually dispute that and perhaps argue that actually in his relationships with young men, who are in the language of the age very much his intellectual and social inferiors, there is a kind of communication that he is sort of sharing. He's sharing his culture, he's sharing his tastes, and he is educating them. So this is actually kind of the argument that he's making in that speech. His story is actually one of just being born in the wrong time. It's as simple as that, really. And the other man that immediately comes to mind is wartime codebreaker and computer pioneer Alan Turing, who had been convicted of homosexuality in 1952 under the same 19th century gross indecency law that sent Oscar Wilde to prison in 1895. But before we get to that, let's just remind ourselves of where we were when we left the tragedy in part 1. Oscar Wilde's libel case has collapsed against the Marquess of Queensberry. A writ for his arrest has been issued. 2 plainclothes policemen have come to the Cadogan Hotel and arrested him, and he is driven to Scotland Yard. There he is charged under Section 11 of the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act with committing acts of gross indecency with other male persons. And he is taken to Bow Street Police Station, booked, taken down to a cell for the night, and at St. James's Theatre, where the importance of being earnest, his great comedy, has been the absolute toast of London, his name is quietly being removed from the advertisements and the playbills. So, we're in the year 1895. The day after he's been taken to Bow Street Police Station, the very next day, the committal proceedings begin. And Carson, the Marquess of Queensberry's barrister, he is not the Crown barrister this time. It's his junior, a man by the name of Charles Gill. Charles Gill brings out the case against Wilde, and he brings it out very methodically. He says, we have a succession of witnesses. We have details of all these assignations. The witnesses describe their encounters with Wilde, and there's a succession. I mean, the case against him, even at this stage, it's obvious that they put a very compelling case against him. They have ruthlessly, methodically compiled the witnesses, but they also have not just the boys, these young men, but they have the people who worked at the hotels, the chambermaids, the servants, the guy at the door, the doorman who would have seen him in. I mean, the most famous story is the chambermaid at the Savoy who says she was shocked. She says she went into Wilde's room and she found the bed sheets and his nightshirt smeared with Vaseline, semen, and what she describes as soil. And I think it's these types of sordid details that find their way into the press night after night that are full of scandal, are full of allegations that really kind of push the public against Wilde. And we should emphasize that actually the records of the trial and of the accusations, they're not actually fully reported in the papers because it's actually seen as being too scandalous for gentle men and gentle women to read. This pushes the public mood to be very anti-Wilde. So the newspapers are calling for his prosecution. There are crowds that cheered the Marquess of Queensberry when Wilde's libel case was dropped. The Observer, for example, says, the people owe a great deal of gratitude for, and I quote, destroying the high priest of decadence. There must be another trial at the Old Bailey or a coroner's inquest, the latter for choice. And of the decadence, of the hideous conceptions of the meaning of art, there must be an absolute end, unquote. So there's a point where it's very clear that this is not just a case about Oscar Wilde. It's a case that has now, as I mentioned last time, it's become very much a case about politics, about a liberal government that's in its death throes. It is a case about artistic decadence against the sense of elitism, of aestheticism, but I think in part it's also a sense of insecurity about what actually Wilde is being accused of. So he's actually been accused of gross indecency, and the papers are saying that sodomy is now a moral offense. It's something that people choose to do in the same way that they might choose to murder or kill someone. But this is being challenged by a novel new understanding of sexuality that is coming in from Germany, where psychologists there have invented this portmanteau term, the fusion of Greek and Latin, homosexuality. The idea that actually, if you commit the act of sodomy, you are likely to be doing it. It's not because you're a sinner, it's because you have a medical condition that is called homosexuality. And how exactly that is to be framed and processed and understood, this is a live challenge at the time. No one had come across this before. It's live as these trials are happening. So Wilde is very much a litmus test. And I think there's a kind of sense of moral confusion and uncertainty as well, which provides kind of part of the background to this. So Wilde is actually moved to Holloway Prison, a very hard prison. It's often thought that Wilde is actually singled out for special treatment because the establishment wants to make an example of him. And by the establishment, I'm talking about the government. But you know what? That's not the case. So even at this point, he has a special cell at Holloway. He is allowed to have food from nearby restaurants. He's given books. He can read letters. And he's allowed a succession of visitors. And his one great visitor is Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas, who is basically the worst man in the world. Certainly the worst man that I've talked about on these podcasts. Wilde describes him as a slim thing, gold head like an angel, who stands always at my side, moving in the gloom like a white flower. So, in fairness to Wilde, there are rival opinions on Bosie, but he's so devoted to Wilde, he loves him so much, he's such a decent fellow, that he actually leaves London for France just before the trial begins. I mean, seriously. Anyway, so the trial begins on Friday, the 26th of April, 1895. Mr. Justice Arthur Charles is presiding. He's a conservative. He's actually a failed conservative politician, but a lovely man. And a surprising thing about this second trial is that it's pretty obvious from the start, and I'm not going to give the game away, by saying right from the beginning, Mr. Justice Charles is biased towards Wilde. He likes him. It's really unexpected, and that's not what the popular sense of this trial is at all. Because what happens in the next sort of 5 days is you have a succession of witnesses, and I'll give you a brief flavor of it by reading from Matthew Sturgis's biography. So you have William Parker telling of how over dinner at Kettner's his brother had repeatedly accepted preserved cherries from Wilde's own mouth. This is in public view. You have Alfred Ward for recounting how during dinner in the private room at the Florence restaurant, Wilde had put his hand inside his trousers. You've got Fred Atkins describing having come back from the Moulin Rouge and he found Wilde in bed with Morris Schwabber. And you have a succession of these witnesses. Now, Sir Edward Clarke, to his great credit, Wilde's barrister from the previous trial, from the failed libel case, to whom Wilde had lied to, by the way, Clarke incredibly, very gallantly says, you know what, Mr. Wilde, I and my team will give our services to you for free to defend you in this case. Wilde at this stage is a bankrupt. So the very fact that Clarke actually comes forward and says that says a lot about him and his team and what he thinks of Oscar Wilde. Clarke's argument is that these people are liars, that they're blackmailing Wilde. The Crown case is based on a pack of lies. You know, these people are condemned. He's basically saying that these people should be condemned by their own mouths as criminals and lowlifes and all this kind of thing. So the case isn't that Wilde did it and he was right to do it. The case is actually that he didn't do it at all. And of course, we know that he did. And this is where he gives the love that dare not speak its name speech, which I read to you at the beginning of this podcast. It's implying that the relationship that he had with men, that it's ennobling and purifying and that it's not sexual. I mean, we know that's not true. On the fourth day, Sir Edward Clarke, Wilde's barrister, actually gives this very rousing defense. He says, Mr. Wilde is not an ordinary man. You know, you shouldn't condemn him on the basis of his writings. He has been incredibly open with these young men. He's been generous to them, which I think is absolutely true. He has been, overly generous, and he has not only been generous, but he's been kind. And he says to finish, and there was nothing indecent about his relationships. So we get to the fifth day, that's Wednesday, the 1st of May, and Sir Arthur Charles, the judge, has to give his summing up. And I think this is extraordinary. He says, don't judge him by his writings. Sometimes his writings, if I may be allowed to criticize his writings myself, they're silly, but wicked, no. Then he goes on to say, is it plausible that a man such as Oscar Wilde would have been so reckless? He cannot fathom that Wilde would have brought the libel or done any of these things. And he actually says, is it plausible that he would have had boys in his bed at the Savoy and there would have been so little attempted concealment? Of course, we know it to be true because we did episode 1. But to the judge, it seems utterly unlikely that an intelligent man would have behaved in such a catastrophic, reckless. I mean, he points out that Wilde has the right to ask you to remember that he is a man of highly intellectual gifts, a person whom people would suppose incapable of any of these actions. And again, that is buying into Wilde's argument in the great speech that, there's something of Plato and Shakespeare and Michelangelo about it and so forth. So he's actually accepting what Wilde says. So the jury go out, and they go out at 1:30 in the afternoon, and the hours go by, and then the jury calls for lunch. And then finally at 5:15, they come back into the court. And as if this wasn't already the stuff of Hollywood, they deliver their verdict. There is no agreement. Therefore, there is no verdict. They can't agree. The government's lawyer, the Crown's lawyer, Charles Gill, says, we will undoubtedly pool for another trial. And Wilde is sent out. There is going to be a trial number 3. Now, at this point, there is some discussion. Some MPs, there's an Irish nationalist MP by the name of T.M. Healy, who says to the Solicitor General, Sir Frank Lockwood, do not put Wilde on trial again, please. And the Solicitor General actually says, I would not do so but for the abominable rumours against Lord Rosebery, against the Prime Minister. So this is actually what I talked about in the first episode, of this sense that the Prime Minister, Lord Rosebery, has been involved in a same-sex relationship, ironically with the eldest son of the Marquess of Queensberry. So it's all kind of a great matrix of supposition that reaches to the absolute tops of government. Now, Sir Edward Carson, Wilde's old Trinity College Dublin classmate, often seen as the villain of this great drama, he apparently also appeals to the government and says to them, look, I don't think you should put Wilde on trial again. So Lord Rosebery, the Prime Minister, he says to Lord Asquith, who's actually Home Secretary at the time, he later becomes Prime Minister, can't we just let him off? We've had enough of this. Can't we just let him go? Can we just let this whole trial go? And Asquith says, we can't, my lord. If we do it now, we will lose the election. And Rosebery at this point, in a state of, frustration, and even though the election is approaching, he's basically just kind of lying in a dark room, not least because, the press are now printing stories saying that this is all part of a conspiracy, a Rosebery, conspiracy, that there is this huge network of wealthy gay men, or as they said at the time, sodomitical men who have covered this up, and they're trying to get Wilde off. So the government feel they actually can't let this go. And I think they wish deep down that Wilde should just go to France. And Wilde's friends are all saying the same thing. They're saying, leave, go to France. So the key thing is, it's at this point that bail is posted for Wilde and he's allowed out. So again, there seems to be a kind of encouragement from the authorities for Wilde to go away to France because they actually want the problem to disappear. But he doesn't. And maybe, and I think this is the prime reason why he doesn't do that, is because his mother, the great poet Speranza, the Irish national poet, to whom he is completely devoted, says to him that if he flees, she will no longer regard him as her son. But if he stays, and even if he goes to prison, she will still love him unconditionally. So I think that's a large part of it. Wilde is completely frozen. He's effectively a broken man. And some very close friends of his come to him and say, look, we love you. We don't want you to be alone. Come and stay with us. This is an unbelievable detail because what they end up doing is putting him up in their child's nursery. And he just sits there day after day on the floor, surrounded by rocking horses and spinning tops and all these kinds of things, rabbits and stuffed toys. And his lawyers come to consult with him in the nursery to tell him that the government won't give up. I mean, can you imagine that scene? They tell him that the government are not going to let you off. Keep in mind that these are people that he had dinner with. In fact, the Solicitor General, Sir Frank Lockwood, has announced that he is going to prosecute the third trial personally, and he's a man that Wilde actually had dinner with on numerous occasions. He's going to do this personally because the Crown want to end this now. They want a conviction and they want Wilde to go away. Wilde is still represented by Clark, who is still doing it for free. I mean, that is extraordinary that he's giving up so much of his time for free because he feels so bad about the first trial in which his own client lied to him, but he still believes in his innocence. Meanwhile, Wilde has to pay costs for the first trial, and as I said, he's officially bankrupt. Effectively because Bosie had actually promised to fund the trial. This is what a good guy Bosie is. And of course, he's skedaddled to the continent, leaving Wilde in every way to face the music. So the trial opens on the 22nd of May. I mean, all this is literally within a few weeks. It's taking place at lightning speed, and that's what makes it so dramatic. Day after day, there are new details of a kind that Victorian newspapers are not used to handling, and they're coming out week after week after week. So 22nd of May, the case returns to the Old Bailey. Wilde is a broken man at this point, so we've talked before about what sort of flippancy, the arrogance almost with which he conducted himself at the very beginning of the first case. Well, that's all gone. No more of that. He is haggard. He is quiet. He's withdrawn. He knows that it's all a disaster, but I'm sure that he's still hoping that a miracle will happen. The trial goes ahead, and I mean, we don't need to reiterate, basically what we heard in the first episode. It's just a rehashing of everything that's gone on before. And Wilde is still clinging to the hope that perhaps the jury will kind of see things as the previous jury had done. And, because if there is no decision reached, then I think it will be abandoned and the government will give up. And so as they're waiting for the verdict, Lockwood says to Clark, "You'll dine your man in Paris tomorrow." But Clark looks at him and says, "Lockwood, I don't think we will." And what I find amazing about that very brief conversation that takes place is that it's extraordinary that the Solicitor General of Great Britain, who's prosecuted the case personally, on Saturday, the 25th of May, says, "I think he's going to get off. I think we've lost." And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Orthodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Orthodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Orthodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. However, the government, in their tenacity, have changed the judge. This judge is less pro-Wilde than the first judge, but look, not excessively anti-Wilde. I mean, his summing up is pretty sort of middle of the road, to be fair. However, when the verdict is delivered and it turns out that Wilde has been found guilty, the jury's only gone for 2 hours. And of course, the longer they're gone, the more optimistic everyone becomes. So they come back in just after 2 hours and they say on count after count, he's guilty. There's only one count that he's found not guilty on, but the rest of the counts he's found guilty. And then Justice Willis, puts on the equivalent of a black cap, a very bad sign, and declares that it is the worst case I have ever tried, that you, Wilde, have been the center of a circle of extensive corruption of the most hideous kind among young men. It is impossible to doubt. Then he delivers the sentence, which is the heaviest that he can legally deliver. 2 years imprisonment with hard labor. And then to finish, the cherry on the cake, he says, "In my judgment, it is totally inadequate as such a case is this." Look, I'm probably being unfair to Justice Willis. I'm sure he didn't sound like that. But when you read the transcripts, it's actually very devastating and rather surprising. For Wilde, look, I mean, he slumps, and this is so moving because this is a man who has made his living and his fame and his reputation out of his brilliance with words. He briefly seems unable to speak, and then he cries out, "And may I say something, my lord?" And the judge kind of waves him silent, and Wilde is hurried out of the dock down the stairs. Just on the trials, my sympathy is obviously drawn to Wilde. He absolutely is the victim in all this. And certainly it would be unnatural for 21st century listeners not to feel sorry for this man. But of course, the truth is Wilde is partly the author of his own demise because of his own recklessness. He's the author of his own demise effectively because he brought that libel case against the Marquess of Queensberry. And I suppose you would say that he did it, in Wilde's defense, he did it because he felt trapped. He felt that he had to settle the issue. He felt that there was nothing else that he could do. I mean, he did, by the standard of the day, commit all these misdemeanors with these blokes. Under the law of the time, he is clearly guilty. And the entire country basically agrees. The overwhelming support for the verdict. I mean, there are voices that are still raised in Wilde's defense, of course. W.B. Yeats, who's a friend of his, the great poet, he describes this whole thing as an orgy of Philistine rancor. What W.B. Yeats is objecting to is not the law, the entire moral structure of Victorian England. It's that he thinks Wilde is an artist. Wilde is special, and therefore Wilde should not be judged like ordinary men. There's a truth to this. And I think there is a belief that Britain is strangely Philistine in its belief and judgment. And I think to a degree that this is really important for the legacy of these trials. The blurring of Wilde's status as a great writer and an artist, and his status as someone who has been identified as, in the public mind with homosexuality, at precisely the time when the concept of homosexuality is starting to come in as something that people in society actually understand, because that understanding is going to be really crucial to understanding homosexuality's long-term impact. Also, the press's reaction speaks to something that the people of Britain would still recognise as a feature of British public life. And it's articulated by Bosie, who said of the verdict that is given on Wilde, "When the great British public has made up its great British mind to crush any particular unfortunate who has power, it generally succeeds in gaining its object." Anyway, enough on Bosie. This is by the by and just me ranting right now. So Wilde is taken initially to Newgate and then to Pentonville Prison. And this is important to say, Wilde was sentenced to 2 years hard labour. But right from the beginning, they say that you don't have to do the hard labour. You're not the hard labour type. You can just do light labour, and I think that there is a sense, even at this point, that people immediately know that Wilde is different from the other prisoners. There is a sensitivity to him, and he will not have to be subjected to every single rigour of the penal system that the others have been subjected to. And I think that reflects that for Wilde, the punishment will be worse for him because he's not a Bill Sikes, the hard man in the Oliver Twist story. Meaning that for someone with Wilde's sensibilities and background, the suffering that will be imposed on most convicts will be harder on someone like Wilde. But for Oscar Wilde, he's in solitary confinement. He's not allowed to talk at all. Prisoners in solitary confinement are prohibited from talking. And this would be impossibly hard for him because he's a communicator. All his life, he's used his voice, his conversation. It's the great thing. It's something that he's absolutely brilliant at. Wilde actually lived for social intercourse, for intellectual stimulation, for the arts, for beauty, for comfort, for good food and ease. And of course, he's an aesthete, someone whose taste is exquisite. For a man like this to go to prison, well, prison is the absolute opposite of all of that. So he's given the convict's uniform with the arrows on it. His head is shaved. He's also fed bromide of potassium, which all prisoners are given to, effectively dull their sexual drive or libido. And he becomes immediately very ill. He has terrible diarrhea, and he also contracts dysentery, and his health immediately collapses. Prisoners in solitary confinement get very little exercise added to this. And there is a story that on one occasion, the man in front of him actually whispers to him, "I'm very sorry for you, Mr. Wilde." And Wilde is so overwhelmed by this kind comment that he says, "Oh, thank you so very much." And of course, he is immediately punished for it because he's not allowed to speak, not even to the guards. And Wilde is this great individualist. He refuses to accept that he is one of the crowd, and I love this about him. This is the whole essence of his artistic and emotional life. And of course, even his name has been taken away from him. Now he just has a prison number. He's referred to by that prison number. That is now who he is. He is just another number in this massive penal system. Meanwhile, his plays have been taken off everywhere, even in America. The Western Mail, a Welsh newspaper, says, "Oscar Wilde will never be anything else other than a memory, a beacon light set up to warn the youth from the dangers that lurk in the life of ease and pleasure. His personality has been wiped out from the haunts of men, and his name has become a byword of reproach." So effectively, he's been cancelled. He's been cancelled by the public. He's been cancelled by the press. But interestingly, he hasn't been cancelled by the ruling Liberal government. And this is such an intriguing detail. There are people high up in the government that are looking out for him. So on the 12th of June, so basically 2 weeks into his sentence, Asquith, the future Prime Minister, a man who's had dinner with him, and another MP, Richard Haldane, the future War Minister, they actually come to see Wilde in prison, and they talk to him about books that they are more than happy to send him. And they say to Wilde, look, we will do what we can for you. We'll give you as many books as you need. So just tell us what you would like. Wilde, and it makes me laugh because Wilde is Wilde. He says, I'd like some novels by Gustave Flaubert. And Haldane says to him, hang on, wasn't he in fact prosecuted himself for indecency? I don't know if that's a great choice, Mr. Wilde. But they agree, and they also agree to St. Augustine, to Cars Mullerman, to the Histories of Rome. He actually gets this special treatment because other prisoners are not allowed books. But Haldane says, we're going to bring you the books. Haldane talks to Asquith afterwards, and they actually commission a report to make sure that he's being treated well. And the head of the prison's commission actually says that, look, we don't want him to be bullied. We don't want him to be harmed. This man is an icon. He is a special person. He's an exceptional person and an exceptional talent. I mean, I find all of this extraordinary. In some ways, it's almost like this 1885 law, the one that's put him into this horrible institution. In one way, they can see that the law is regressive and it should be changed. And now, of course, what they're trying to do is make his 2 years easier for him, more palatable for him. And I think that's a rather noble thing for them to do. The true hostility for Wilde is actually coming from the public. The warders actually really take to him and they like him. And there is one horrible episode that illustrates, this public hatred. He's being transferred from London to Reading Gaol. He's being transferred effectively to a country prison because the authorities think that a city prison is too hard for him. So he's taken to Clapham Junction railway station and he's forced to stand between two of his warders for half an hour while they wait for the train to arrive. And of course, people recognize him and they start to form a crowd around him and they start jeering at him. And then one man steps forward and spits on him. Appalling behavior. Wilde writes later that for a year after that was done to him, he wept every day at the same hour and for the same space of time. It's heartbreaking stuff. It's also very moving. So off he goes to Reading and he's there for 18 months. Life is better there. The air is cleaner. And weirdly, the jail was actually built on the site of a leper colony. And I find there's a certain irony there because Wilde is actually a leper in the eyes of the public. Wilde and the governor don't get on very well, but luckily he's not there for very long, and he's replaced by a Major James O. Nelson, whom Wilde absolutely loves. And O. Nelson is actually kind and generous, and he actually saves Wilde, I think, from having a complete breakdown. He has empathy, and for sure he sympathizes with Wilde's position. And keep in mind, too, with Reading, most of the prisoners would have been from the surrounding villages and not, very bad types. If truth be told, they're probably guilty of things like, minor thefts and things like that. And they're working class blokes. And Major O. Nelson and Wilde have regular meetings and they chat about books and the classics. And O. Nelson actually says to Wilde, I'd like you to decide what books we have in the prison library. He allows Wilde to have a notebook and a pen, something that's unheard of, and he allows him to write. And the great thing that he writes in this time is a letter to Bosie. Well, that's the bad thing, but he writes this great letter which actually stretches to 100 pages. So we know that Wilde is being looked after in prison, and while he's in Reading Gaol, he becomes rather popular with his fellow inmates. And, he's kind to his other prisoners. He is unjudgmental. And he's democratic with his warders. He talks to them about books and educates them, gently educates them. He helps them enter competitions in magazines and newspapers, which is fantastic. And, for one of the warders, he actually wins a silver tea service. And for another of the warders, he wins a grand piano, all because he helps them, with their witticisms. And I think what that shows is his claim that the young men that he had been sleeping with, he actually treated them as equals. and he treated them with kindness, and that he shared his conversations with them about art and literature and so on. He said this during his trial, and I think this is all true, and we can see it because this is what he does with his warders. And of course, although that's all true, it's not the whole story. We know that. He was certainly in a position of power. He was wealthy. He was older. And look, everyone who listens to this podcast will have a completely different view of Oscar Wilde. Yes, he was very rich. He was a very rich, articulate man who had relationships. No, not relationships. There were brief assignations with very young men who were poor, who are... Look, I'm arguing with myself here. There are two ways that you can interpret that. You can say that they are having fun, so let them crack on, or you can say there is a power dynamic which we now feel uncomfortable with. On that point, W.T. Stead, who is... he's a campaigning newspaper editor. He highlights what he calls the white slave trade, or the exploitation of young white girls by rich and powerful men. Doesn't this sound familiar in this day and age? And this was 100 years ago. Anyway, I digress. Stead has led a very powerful campaign to raise the age of consent for girls in the UK from the age of 13 to the age of 16. And this is in the 1880s. And his commentary of the Wilde trial is to say, you have sentenced Wilde for sleeping with young men who are 17, 18, and 19, but you are not charging men who are sleeping with females, female prostitutes, female girls who were 13, 14, and 15. And he's making this point not to defend Wilde, but to highlight the fact that women at this age and younger are subject to the exploitation by wealthy men, as are boys. And of course, as I said, it's still something that's happening now, and we're still fighting against it. We're supposed to learn by history, but I think what history actually teaches us is that we never learn. We keep on making the same mistakes. And in fairness, these are clearly very complicated issues. And, movements like the Me Too and Stonewall movements where people hold a moral position are important, and every listener will have a view. Before I sum up the long-term impact of this case, and I really think this case has an important impact on morality in the 21st century, Wilde is released on the 18th of May. And again, the establishment don't want to humiliate him. So there is a lot of trying to... there's a lot of trying to protect him at this stage, and they decide to move him from Reading, where there's going to be a lot of reporters waiting outside, to Pentonville Prison. And there's a wonderful story, actually, that comes from, I'll read again from Matthew Sturgis's biography on Wilde, because it's just a brilliant story that should be told. So he's going to be put on a train at Twyford, and he's standing between two warders who are escorting him, and it's the first time that he's been out of prison. And he's standing there on the platform, and he sees a large tree on the other side of the rails. And he shouts, "Oh, beautiful world, and he waves his arms all enthusiastically. And Warder Harrison, who's the senior of the two, turns and looks at him and says, Now, Mr. Wilde, you mustn't give yourself away like that. You're the only man in England that would talk like that at a railway station." And I think that beautifully captures the imagination and the relationship that Wilde has with his warders. They are amused by him and they like him. So Wilde actually comes out from this period as likable. Actually, I would say he actually comes out as lovable. And that's what makes the ambivalences around his sentencing so complex. The establishment also loved him, but then, like now, they get away with murder. And of course, there is no recourse. So Wilde is out, and the public opinion of him hasn't changed, so he decides to go abroad to France, which is where he should have gone in the first instance. And who does he meet up with? Bosie. Wilde is a bankrupt, and he's relying on a monthly allowance that is given to him by his wife. They decide not to divorce, they just separate. And I really don't want to get into his relationship with Bosie because I have absolutely no time for him. Suffice to say that their relationship is now tempered with hatred. The fun has gone out of it. Thankfully, they don't stay together long, and Wilde moves to Paris, a city that he's always loved, and I have to say a city that's always loved him. And this is actually where he dies just a year later, aged 46. He has an ear infection that steadily gets worse. He actually picked it up in prison when he had a fall. And it gets worse and worse and eventually spreads to his brain. And it's a very grim ending. You know, he's penniless. However, and this says volumes about Oscar Wilde, he was surrounded by his close friends who came across from England. And I think he was a man that actually inspired lifelong friendship. So Wilde left us a legacy, and it's not just martyrdom. Much more important than that, it's the association of Wilde with this novel and evolving concept of homosexuality, which is entering public discourse in Britain at exactly this time. Wilde is the mold. And what I mean by that is that when one thinks of homosexuals at this time, Wilde actually comes to mind. You know, his flamboyance, his aestheticism, his dandyism, his fashion, and his wit. Unfortunately, also, the word predator comes to mind, which is how the man in the street sees Wilde. And of course, this was absolutely terrible for gay rights and gay people. And, you know, for whatever reason, Britain is peculiarly hostile to gay people in the early 20th century, right up until the revolution that came about in the 1960s. And I don't understand why. In fact, one of the Sunday pictorials, and I can't remember which one it was, but I know it was in the 1950s, it actually had a double-page spread. In fact, they serialized the bloody thing, and it was titled, How to Spot a Homo. Can you imagine? And some of the reasons that they gave was, well, a fondness for the theatre, dandyish clothes, liking flowers, humming to songs by Doris Day. Seriously? Then again, apart from Doris Day, who was around after Wilde's death, I mean, it's all Oscar Wilde, isn't it? And that rubs against the Puritanism of Britain, of British culture. You know, there's a complete distrust of flamboyance and aestheticism. Thankfully, Wilde dies unrepentant for what he did and what he is. And you have to admire that about the man. He stood for his convictions. He doesn't feel ashamed about his sexual identity, and he embodies a sense of pride in what he is. Wilde was certainly an anomaly and an enigma, and a man too early for his time, and he certainly paved the way for the gay revolution that happened many decades later. I would argue that he is more famous now than when he was actually at his creative best. As I said, I love his works. I think he was an absolute genius. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening in. It's been an absolute pleasure to bring Wilde's story to you. There's not enough said about the man as far as I'm concerned. And I think if anyone's really interested in kind of putting this into pictorial, have a look at Wilde, the movie, when you get a chance. It's played by the amazing Stephen Fry, a great friend of the show. It's a movie that really kind of takes you on the Wilde journey that I've described to you in these 2 episodes in a very stylish, only Stephen Fry way. Again, thank you for listening in, folks. It's been an absolute pleasure. Please drop me an email if you have any questions on rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com. I'm loving the mail that's coming through. Thank you. And I look forward to speaking to you soon. Bye for now.